Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Charles Haynes is my name. And I didn't mean to turn my back on you, Mike, but I couldn't see the other end of the row here. Oh, thank you so much. The afternoon is looking to the future. My good friend Os Guinness says that when you speak after lunch, it's the art of speaking in someone else's sleep. But I trust that you are so committed and interested in this topic that that will not be the case this afternoon. And we'll want to get to you, all of you who have as much expertise as any of us sitting up here in the conversation as soon as possible. So we'll get underway. You have the bios of all of our panelists, so I'm not going to repeat all of that for you. I'll tell you that so you'll know who's sitting where if you haven't met everybody already. Mark Chancey sitting here, who's professor of religious studies at Southern Methodist University. And then next to Mark is Sufia Asmat, and she's the executive director of the Council of Islamic Schools in North America. And next to her is Bernadine Futrell, who is director of leadership services at the American Association of School Administrators, AASA, which is the superintendent's organization in this country. And then next to her is Kelly O'Reilly. We just met. So Kelly O'Reilly is a teacher in world history at Fern Creek High School in Kentucky. And then finally, Mary Juswick, who is professor in two departments, teacher education and English at Michigan State University. So I appreciate the panel getting us started on the future, and appreciate all of you being here to participate in what I think is a very important conversation. I will say the obvious and apologize for not being with you this morning. For personal reasons, I could not do it, but I mustered every energy I have to be here this afternoon, so I'm very happy that I did make it. But I knew you would be in great hands because we have such wonderful people invited and present. And also, I have to give a special shout out to Ben Marcus, who did so much to organize all of this and has done such a wonderful, wonderful job. You know, Ben, I've been doing this for like 30-some years, right? In other words, I'm old. And I think it's always wonderful to pass the torch. So it really is.
We need a picture of
Yeah,
that.
you know, so there you go. Good luck, because you're going to need it. I've lived through so many iterations of this issue that I know you're going to need it. I just want to say as we start that the obvious, and that this is an important topic. And of course, I would say that because it's been a lifelong passion. But I think it's important at this moment in our history particularly. I don't know if you heard earlier this morning Tom Gelton's report on NPR. He was talking to rabbis about what they're going to say on Sunday when Rosh Hashanah and the High Holy Days start. What are you going to say? And so it was an interesting piece, but it struck me that what a task. What are you going to say? Right? What are those rabbis going to say at this moment? At a time when they've had to increase security at every synagogue in the United States and around the world, at a time when people have been killed worshiping in a synagogue, at a time when synagogues have been defaced, at a time when in our country, you know, mosques are being attacked and Hindus and Sikhs are being attacked. And I mean, it's an extraordinary moment in the United States. And not to mention around the world, of course, where people in concentration camps in China because of their religion, or their genocide in Burma, and, you know, as you all know. So now, having said that, I don't want to pretend or exaggerate and say somehow, oh, religious literacy, you know, that's the silver bullet for all this. Of course it isn't. The challenges we face are so complex and great. do believe that religious literacy, I do believe that religious literacy is one of the essential ingredients in the recipe for peaceful coexistence. You know, essential ingredient. Because as everyone in this room knows so well, you know, ignorance and fear are root causes of hate, intolerance, and violence, right? And so the work that you all are doing, that we all are doing in this arena, you know, will help determine whether this experiment in religious freedom, this experiment in a pluralistic democracy with so many people of different religions and beliefs continues and thrives or not. So that's how important I think this is, what we're talking about. So, to the panel. And the panel was very gracious in helping formulate questions. So I am really going to give back to them the things that they said they wanted to talk about. And the first thing we're going to do is let each one of them say just briefly how their lives, their background connects to this work, what's important to them in this work, as a way of kind of introducing them in another way, just besides reading the bio, you know. And you know, why don't we go down the line and start with you, Mark?
My bio and how it connects to this work. Yeah. Yes, so in 2005, I was an untenured assistant professor in biblical studies, reading the Dallas Morning News, and learned that public schools offer Bible courses from a controversy story about a situation in West Texas, in Odessa, Texas. And in that situation, a parent said, I know that it is legal to offer Bible courses if they are taught in appropriate ways, but I do not believe that this course has that intention. The people pushing this course are trying to proselytize. My daughter's Jewish. She's already bullied for being a religious minority. And if you bring this course in, I think her life is going to be, this particular course, your life is going to be even worse, and I'm going to fight you tooth and nail. I was so moved by that situation, and it just made the human dimension so real of this high school student, religious minority out in West Texas, and her father willing to risk all of his stature in the community to defend her religious freedom and make her school a safe place. And so as I think about these issues, we all have these stories, right, that motivate us. But I always think about that, and that led me to think, well, how could I as a biblical scholar become more involved? How could I as a religious studies scholar get more involved? And I discovered that I have many colleagues in religious studies and biblical studies who also wanted to find ways to plug in. And of course, several of us are here today.
And I would just say, I don't want to make editorial comments all the way along, I promise, but I have to say this, Mark's research on these courses, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there's some very good courses out there, but his research on that has been seminal. I mean, I don't think we would know what's going on out there in these Bible courses if it hadn't been for the leadership and the scholarship of Mark Chansey. All right, Sophia, I'm going to turn to you now.
Okay. I have a couple of stories I want to share with you, and I think they go towards illustrating the need for acknowledging the diversity within our various faith communities. They'll go towards acknowledging the need to teach about religion from younger grades at the beginning at the elementary school level, and the importance of engaging our communities, our parents and the adults in our communities, not just school children. So when my daughter was in second grade, she was in an Islamic school. I have two children. They both attended Islamic school their entire lives, and then one went on to Rutgers University and received her master's in English education. The other is completing his JD PhD in philosophy at Harvard, so he's working on his dissertation. But they're the product of Islamic schools. When my daughter was in second grade, my mother-in-law was visiting us from Pakistan. And she was talking to my daughter about, how she likes her school and who are her friends and what are their names. And she rattled off names that didn't sound Pakistani. There were Egyptian names and Arab names and Lebanese and so forth. They sounded very unfamiliar to my mother-in-law. And she said, really, where are these girls from? And my daughter looked at her very quizzically and said, I don't know, but they're all Muslim. And it really dawned on me that this is really important. It doesn't matter where they're from. And there is such diversity within Islam. We often, as Muslims, don't acknowledge it, right? So there's the importance of that. And this was in second grade. So fast forward 20 years or so, I am working with a coalition, a group of Jewish schools, and trying to do some interfaith activities with our Islamic schools and Jewish schools. So one of the rabbi at one of the schools in northern New Jersey arranged a program where he invited 2 Islamic schools, they're 8th graders, and it would be his school. His school's larger, so we had to have 2 different Islamic schools because their enrollment is much smaller. Got everything set up. They were to visit during the day. The night before, one of the Islamic schools called and said that she was really sorry. The principal said she couldn't come because the board had found out about this visit, and they were concerned because, well, what is this Jewish school they're going to, and what do they think about the Palestine, question and so on. I was like, oh my gosh, it was so embarrassing for me, and I realized that we have to get the parents and the board members and the adults on board because the kids were all excited, and I can speak more about what we did as a result of that issue, but it just has made me be more dedicated and devoted to bringing our communities together, especially using, the role that I have, the insight that I have with Islamic schools. I think there's a great deal that can be done in the elementary school arena as well as throughout K-12.
Thank you, Sophia. Bernadine.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm again Bernadine Petrell. First, want to say thank you, Ben, for the invitation, and thank you for everyone for allowing me to be in this space, in this room. I recognize just how important the work that you're doing is, and even how valuable I hope we can be as I learn more and better understand the work. The reason I'm here, and we got an invitation to join, and I started thinking about the what of the summit, and then I thought, well, as school superintendents, the work that I do is to develop and support our educators as they go out and lead, the charge of public education. And what I find from professional experience, I have to kind of qualify both, is sometimes we're unable to have conversations across functions or across even ideas in order to advance what we all can agree on. And so in my professional role, my job really is to develop school leaders by understanding and identifying key areas where they can benefit from, and then creating learning opportunities for our superintendents to go deeper. From my personal side, I'm a minister at my church, and I have 2 small children, and I want the best for them. And what I understand is it's less about, and you said it earlier, it's less about redefining and re-understanding, but it's more about figuring out how to communicate so that people can be moved to action. And just a small story, if I could, when my son was 2 years old, we took him to his first Easter egg hunt, and they said, go. My 2-year-old ran. He ran past all of the eggs, he ran past all of the children, and he just kept running. And I'm on the video with a shaky hand saying, it's not a race, Michael, it's not a race. But what he heard was, this is a race, this is what you do. And so it just was a nice, friendly reminder for me as a parent about to enter the public schools with my kid, being a scholar who studied public education, where it kind of converged to say, you have to be mindful, not of the words that you say, but the listening you create when you say those words. And so I'm hopeful that as I listen in on today, and hopefully I could share some perspectives from the district administrator to learn and grow with you all in this understanding, but also to just add value to the conversation where I can. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernadine. Okay, Kelly.
Hi. So I'm going to tell you about my journey as a teacher. I did not plan to become a teacher. It happened out that way because of religious studies. So I was in the International Baccalaureate program in high school, which gave me a lot of college credits. So my freshman year, I wanted to take a bunch of cool classes. And there was a course offered on the soul, and so it looked at different ways communities imagine the soul, and that kind of set it off for me. I would take as many different religious studies classes as they offered, and luckily I was in a university, I was at Georgia State. They have a substantial religious studies program, so I decided to get a master's, and I was even considering a PhD. And while I was working on my master's, I had the opportunity to teach 2 Intro to World Religions classes. And that's where I found my love for teaching, especially with younger undergraduate students. So I decided I wasn't ready personally for the workload of a PhD, and I thought teaching would be easier. I might as well have just gotten 2 PhDs. So I was recruited by Teach Kentucky, and they placed me in 6th grade, which was not what I expected, because my religious studies master's is not recognized by the state of Kentucky as a core content degree. So I taught 6th grade for a few years, taught 8th grade for a few years. Last year I taught 9th grade, this year I'm teaching 10th grade, and I've never had the opportunity to teach a standalone world religions class. Everything I do is integrated into the curriculum that the district creates and the standards that the state creates. So while I'm teaching and I'm trying to bring in religious studies into my instruction, I'm also trying to develop my own understanding of how do I teach about religion, because what I learned in college, how do I translate that to a 6th grader? How do I help them understand that religions are diverse, dynamic, and culturally embedded in a way that they can conceptualize when they are such concrete thinkers? They're not really abstract thinkers quite yet in the way that a college student is. So I have attended various professional developments on religious studies. I've participated in the Religious Literacy Projects training. I've been with the NEH Religious Worlds of New York program. And I found a program based in Boston called the Oberoi Foundation. And the Oberoi Foundation was started for the purpose of training teachers about Indian religion and culture. And through the Oberoi Foundation, I've been able to extend what I've learned to approximately 25 teachers. We just started a couple years ago, and so I'm now part of the PD world, helping with educating teachers about religious studies. I also helped write the standards for Kentucky's historical and cultural influences of the Bible course, and that was a phenomenal experience, which I'm happy to talk about. The course is not currently offered at my high school, so I helped write the standards for a class that I'm not even teaching, but I'm pushing for it. The hesitation is, of course, are we favoring Christianity and Judaism by focusing on the Bible, and that's a concern for my school. But in sum, I'm continuing to seek every opportunity that I can to marry education with religious studies. Those are my 2 passions, and I'm hoping to, well, I already have learned so much from everyone here today, and I'm excited to take it back to my classroom.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Mary?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, including the ones around the podium who I can't see. So I've been teaching mostly in public schools, mostly in the United States for the past 26 years, I just calculated. I've taught 5th grade, 6th grade, middle school, high school. Now I'm a college instructor. I teach at a large public university in a teacher education program and in an English department. And my understanding of my role here is to really bring to the conversation the English language arts curriculum and how that might be a part of things. But I'm going to do this in a kind of a very Englishy sort of a way. by sharing a couple, I'm first of all going to share part of a bio statement that I wrote for a book that Kevin Burke and a few others and I have coming out on Routledge. We decided to write bio statements that wove together our spiritual and academic stories. And I think more of this kind of owning where we come from as teachers and as scholars can be very powerful. And so that's where I'm going to start. My parents were part of the Jesus movement in the late 1960s and 70s in north central Ohio. And my earliest childhood memories include attending home meetings rather than church, being surrounded by people of all ages singing lively praise music to the strumming of acoustic guitars and the clapping of hands and tambourines, and being prayed over by my parents' friends at Bible study because I was so strong-willed. God did not seem inclined to answer those prayers, it turned out. In the mid-1970s, my family began attending a Grace Brethren church, and I was schooled at the associated ACSI, Association of Christian Schools International, school through 8th grade, an experience that resonated with a school described in Peshkin's Ethnography, God's Choice, if you're familiar with that older book. My evangelical education continued in the Grace Brethren Church High School Youth Group and as an undergraduate English major at Wheaton College in suburban Chicago, after which I spent nearly 20 years mostly avoiding church. That was a fairly typical demographic trend. For the past decade, however, I've been participating in the life of the congregation at All Saints Episcopal Church in East Lansing, Michigan, and in spiritual practices such as prayer, meditation, Lectio Divina, spiritual retreat, and I could go on and on. But I want to move from there to return to the themes of religious literacy and religious studies education guiding this summit. And in terms of English language arts, I was thinking about a number of scenarios over the years that have got me interested in as English educator in religion, taking religion seriously, as it's been said. So, scenario one, in the mid-2000s, a New Yorker reading pre-service teacher who was doing her student teaching at a high school in a region in Michigan known for conservative Reformed Christianity reported back in the secondary English teaching methods class that I was in charge of that she had conducted a survey with her students as readers, kind of asked them about their reading practices and backgrounds. It's a very typical thing that English language arts teachers do. And some number of these students, I can't remember if it was one or half the class, reported to her that the Bible was their favorite book. And she did not know what to do with this information. Neither did I. Second case, and this is my, I brought a little book to share with you and pass around because I think it's absolutely stunning. And I'm going to start with this table right here. In teaching a young adult literature course for the English department a few years ago, I discovered and shared with students Gene Yang's pair of brilliant comic books, Boxers and Saints, which narrates the story of the Boxer Rebellion from the perspective of both sides of the rebellion, one perspective for each set of the volume. There's a two-book set. An uprising that, among other objections to imperialist foreign intrusion, centered around the colonization of Christianity. After witnessing Christian missionaries destroy the Chinese gods and brutally beat his father, the protagonist finds purpose in the voices of ancient Chinese gods as he joins up with the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists to fight. The second book offers the story of a fourth daughter, marginalized by her family, who, hearing the voice of the Saint Joan of Arc, finds a place for herself through conversion to Christianity. The pair of books, for me, offered one of the most fascinating commentaries on mystical experience and religious extremism that I have found in contemporary children's and young adult literature. So I just wanted to share this with you. And I could go on. A number of curricular items, this I believe essays in the English and social studies curriculum. Religion has come into my work. It's come to me. But at the same time, I have never really thought of my project as being a religious literacy educator or or advancing the project of religious studies education. I see my project more as how can I take religion seriously as a teacher educator, as a researcher and scholar working on the English language arts.
Thank you so much, Mary. And that's a good, I think, bridge to a first kind of definitional question. Some of you on the panel wanted to make sure we were all defining these things in a way that we understood across the panel. And Mary just mentioned about taking religion seriously. And for me, religious literacy involves taking religion seriously. And I have my idea about that and what that would, Warren Nord and I together have an idea about that. But there are many different ways of talking about religious literacy and religious studies. So just to give everybody, anybody who wants to, you don't have to, an opportunity to say something more about the definitions of those terms that you think would be clarifying. What you just gave us, I think, is very clarifying for how you've come at this. And others may have something else you want to say, just so that if there's something about these terms that you want the audience to know that you see and understand, you can share it now, just so we know what how you're defining these terms in your own life and work. Anybody want to comment on that?
I'll start.
Okay, thanks, Kelly.
My conception of religious literacy is constantly changing. I feel like the scholarship on it is still developing. So what I started out in when I was teaching 6th grade, it was, I just want them to know the basics, the building blocks of religions, what the founder's name is, what sacred texts do they read, and what are some rituals and beliefs that they hold. And now I see it more as a skill-based approach to teaching about religion, where I'm not only teaching kids to think about religion as diverse, dynamic, and culturally embedded, but I'm also teaching them how to have difficult conversations with people who don't have the same viewpoints as them, or I'm teaching them how to bracket and suspend judgment for a moment in order to understand somebody else. So it's this blending of content and skills that I would define religious literacy as.
Thanks. Bernadine, do you have something?
Sure, I would kind of echo Kelly's notion about it being a skill. I see religious literacy as it's a continuum. So I don't think there's a 100% or 0%, but I think it is a skill where one can understand how others consume knowledge and how others see the world. And I think for me, from the public education perspective, it has to be positioned in a way that people can understand that some of the outcomes of having a high level of religious literacy includes being able to engage in various spaces with different types of people. But I think at the fundamental definition of religious literacy is understanding that there are different ways that people see and consume knowledge and the world, and being aware and understanding those differences and understanding even the similarities in that makes one literate in terms of religious studies.
Thank you. Sophia?
I would just speak to cautioning ourselves that there really has to be a really good balance between teaching the skill and content. I was at a board meeting for the Council of American Private Education, and the executive director of NAIS, the National Association of Independent Schools, was talking about a study they've done recently and how in the US we've moved from a content-based curriculum from, more than 50 years ago is what it used to be, to a skills-based curriculum, more so, more focused on skills rather than content. So a lot of our school children are not getting the kind of content that's, really vital to good understanding, good literature and so forth. So I think that's great. There needs to be that skill base, but we want to make sure that content is really strong and rigorous as well.
I would just add, I think skills, but more so the disposition is what I'm speaking about. So I see it as a through line in how you integrate the content but it's a disposition to learning and engaging with your world and understanding others. I use skill as an example, but it's skills and disposition so that your action is driven by that.
And I agree with everything that's been said. I'd emphasize the civic dimension again, which has been a theme of our entire conference so far. The other thing I would note in terms of religion across the curriculum, which is something I also think is very important, we've talked primarily about social studies contexts, we've talked some about English language arts contexts, but some curricular areas that haven't come up are music and art, for example. And art history, not a very common elective, but where it is offered, religion is traditionally very much a part of that. It shows up, for example, at least in the advanced placement standards to an incredible degree. Likewise, religion in music, for music classes, whether it be chorus or band or whatever, a very fraught subject because it's often not handled well, but certainly there is great potential there. So across the curriculum, I'm sure there are areas that I'm not thinking of that we could also add to that.
Economics.
Unfortunately, in Texas, sex ed,
Sex ed. Yeah.
right, Bible
Yeah.
verses, not a positive role model.
If you spend 12 years teaching people subjects through a secular lens only, then you don't get to the point of how people see the world. You don't get to that. You don't really get that. So the serious treatment of religion, I think we're a long way from really talking about how to do that. Yes, Mary?
You know, I think there's another point that could be made here in the spirit of taking religion seriously, although I'm not sure it speaks to religious literacy definitions per se. And it comes to me through Kwame Anthony Appiah's new book, The Lies That Bind, has a chapter about creed that I found interesting. And one of the points he makes, and he's not the first to make this point, but I think he makes it rather well, that if you think you learn about religion just by learning about someone's belief, it's a very limited vantage point, because you've also got things like communities, practices, traditions, different practices around, dramatically different practices and meanings around scripture, say. It's very big, but I think what my point here is to look beyond belief and believers or something like that, which is actually a very Christian-centric way of approaching the question. So.
You just sang Ben Marcus's song. He's
Oh,
over there.
okay. Well,
He's over
let's do
there
a
saying,
duet.
Right on. So let's get into some of the future-oriented questions, because that's kind of the kickoff for this afternoon. And this is the big question, I guess. The first question is the big question, and that is, what barriers or obstacles would have to be removed in order to teach religious literacy more effectively, including taking religion seriously? I mean, so what are in your different perspectives and different worlds, what is standing in the way for the future of this, of what we're talking about, this serious treatment? Call it religious literacy, religious studies. What are the obstacles? Mark, you want to start?
You know, one of the obstacles is has already been brought up. I don't see now, but the politicization of the subject. Talking about religion in public schools has, of course, always been political. That's nothing new. But I do think we are seeing this manifest in new ways, so that things are more politicized, more polarized, and frankly more partisan than they have been in the past. And it's in ways that are really unhealthy. You know, I can think of examples with Bible electives, something that I've studied a lot, and the way that they have become increasingly politicized. You know, they are inherently controversial to begin with, and often not done very well. But we now have a situation where we have Project Blitz, a group of religious right organizations trying to blitz state legislatures with bills that promote basically Christian nationalism. You know, it's sometimes stealth Christian nationalism, sometimes not so stealthy Christian nationalism. And one of their model bills for state legislators to emulate is the Bible Literacy Act. So this is all about getting Bible electives in public schools so that we can help turn the United States back towards what they see and understand to be its Christian roots. Then we add to that not just Project Blitz, but the 2016 Republican platform, which included a plank calling for Bible electives because biblical knowledge is essential for an educated citizenry. And that's the first time in American history that the platform of one of the major parties has lifted up and highlighted one particular sacred text in that way and tied it to national identity. And so when we get something like Trump's tweet back in January starting to turn back, more classes, more states doing Bible classes, this is great. We have more Bible elective bills this year than ever before in American history. This is a new thing. We're seeing this, we're all talking about a broad religious literacy, but we're seeing a strong political effort to narrow it down in one direction to promote a very narrow, constrained view of American identity, which none of us shares.
Well, and Mark, many of us in this room, including myself, being hoist by our own petard. We set this up. I mean, I drafted the guidelines on how you deal with the Bible in public schools.
Right.
We had Christian Legal Society, People for the American Way, they're great guidelines, legal guidelines. But these folks use our guidelines
Right.
and use the language of, biblical literacy as the cover. I mean, I'm just going to be political here. I mean, as a cover for what they want to achieve. They have no intention of doing what we actually say in the guidelines, but we've created a different environment in public education for Bible electives, a more constitutionally safe environment, if you will, and guidelines. But then what comes in through those guidelines is much more difficult to navigate, and that's what your work has pointed out.
Exactly. Well, in effect, what they're doing is they are weaponizing religious literacy to undermine religious liberty, which makes our task all the more urgent. But I don't think this is going to change in an election cycle or two. I think that we're going to have, I think this is going to be an action that's going on for at least a couple of decades or more, because the root cause driving it is demographic change and resistance to that demographic change. I think that's one of the root causes. That demographic change is going to keep on happening, and as it happens, there will be those who push back against it by trying to wedge in this very narrow understanding of American identity that meshes it with a particular understanding of Christianity in ways that are counterproductive.
Okay, so one minor obstacle. What are the other what are the other barriers and obstacles that you see? That's easy. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, what are the other obstacles and barriers you see to really going forward in the future and taking this seriously? Anybody?
I think something very specific, and I'm speaking from where I'm coming from as a K-12 educator in Islamic schools specifically, is the push or the fear among the parents. And one of the to be very specific, one of the fears that was stated was that they're afraid of losing their children. So I think that's a barrier. So that we have to work on, we're talking about religious literacy in K-12 in schooling, but we have to work on the parents, the community at large.
Losing their children means?
Meaning to another religion, to not wanting to follow that faith anymore because they learned about something that sounds more fun, more exciting. We all want a Christmas tree and presents. We get that a lot in the Islamic schools.
Well, then it's a good thing they have Emil Lester's report to read. Where's Emil? Is he still here? He skipped out because he knew I was going to talk about it. But his report on the Modesto public schools shows, and at least in that one study, we don't have many studies on this, that students who took world religions did not
it's an unfounded fear.
Yeah, it's unfounded, but we have to have evidence to show that.
There he
and
is.
that goes back to research. I was just telling him to read your study, Emil, and you were out of it. Yeah, because you show that students don't change their religion at least in the Modesto context, they don't change their religion because taking away religions. On the contrary, they feel more deeply about their own.
So actually, myself and a couple of colleagues did some research, some surveys for alumni of Islamic schools, and I spoke to them one-on-one, not just did a survey that we sent out, about the types of interfaith activities they'd engaged in and what did they feel, what came out of that. And many of those students actually said that the administrators or teachers or parents were afraid that we weren't going to be able to handle ourselves, or we were going to, lose our way. But many of the students said they felt stronger about their own faith, having had the opportunity to talk about it with those of other faiths. So yeah, the parents' fears are unfounded, but we do need more research.
We need research and need to let them know that. Bernadine, you want to weigh in on this?
Sure.
Obstacles.
Well, it was already shared, but I think one of the bigger pieces when I come from the district perspective is we're reactionary. And so, the loudest voices are heard. And so if there is a consistent effort to fully educate what religious literacy is, you have to continue that drumbeat so that the people that are making the decisions, it stays relevant for them as they go through and make decisions, because they're, and I can say this joke because my husband was an elected official, but they're almost as good as the last conversation on a particular topic. And for example, when he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, he said, my number one issue is the Sea of Japan. I had no idea before these conversations what the Sea of Japan was, but it's a conversation about how to communicate which country owns the Sea of Japan in Virginia and U.S. history textbooks. And so as a legislator, he's being presented with various views on it, but it's really the views that have the resources and the knowledge to really lobby in a way and to provide the information. So I say that to say when we talk about school superintendents, it has to be, it can't be, reactionary. We can't just come out, and when I say we, I'm using we for my personal life, not the school superintendent's life, but we can't just come out when something is egregious and say, wait. That's not what we meant. That's not what we intended. That's not anything that we're trying to promote. But you have to own the narrative, continue to own the narrative, and inform those stakeholders, because, again, they're sometimes on issues where they're not deeply passionate about or knowledgeable about, they're as great as the last conversation.
Bernadine, just to follow up on that, superintendents, many of them went to the Let Sleeping Dogs Lie School of School Administration. And of course, as Mark says, this topic is historically very controversial. Mm-hmm. And still today, with all the progress we've made, we know we can teach about religion and so forth. There are a lot of people who are afraid of it. And superintendents are political, and they have a school board to answer to. They have parents. So in what sense do you see superintendents going forward in the future? Mm-hmm. How can we turn them into obstacles, if that's the case in many districts, not because they're against it personally, but because of their role, mm-hmm. turn it into opening the door, right? Because they're the gatekeepers. Yeah. David Calloway can tell you that in Georgia Boy. I mean, mm-hmm. they're the gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. You have to have them. If you don't have them, you're not going to get in that school district. So how do we get them to be that person that'll say, yes, we want to do this, rather than this is too controversial, I'm afraid?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So what we do and what we've been able to do is we convene our leaders in what we call cohorts and I forget the other C word, but we convene them together over the course of the year for sustained content, networking, plus professional learning. We used to just do the one conference and walk away, but now we're creating these opportunities for smaller groups to get together and learn and study. And we usually create those study groups based on a need that a member has expressed. We were approached around the topic of social and emotional learning. And if you kind of go back to the history of that may sound like character education. You go back further in the history, it sounds like other things that are highly politicized, and we didn't think they would come out for it. But because we're their member organization, they feel safe and they have conversations. And once people start having conversations, the level of awareness is raised, and you get superintendents putting out directives or leading the charge or leading the conversations around particular challenges that people may be afraid of or not approach. I don't have an example for religion, but that's probably the closest one, because there's a lot of pushback in educational research history around character education. We're trying to take your kids and change them to who we want them to be in public schools, and so it's resurfacing, but it's coming from their leadership rather than a reactionary place. And so the school boards tend to, in most instances, trust the leader that they've selected to lead the schools and to lead the charge. And so it's a matter of raising their awareness, which is what we've been able to do in a lot of issues. And even I was sharing with our team earlier today at the table, we have a national initiative called Redefining Ready. And what we did in that group is we said, okay, you guys, you disagree, teaching to the test and all of that rhetoric around that. Let's come together as a group of superintendents and let's talk about what does it mean to be college and career ready. It was 20 superintendents 4 years ago. Now it's 21 state ESSA plans that have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. 21 plans in states have redefining ready language embedded in their state information, because the superintendents are leading the charge and they're coming together and they're coming to the states. But one small example of an impact when you get people to actually talk about it in the same space is we talk about language and how loaded language can be, and how loaded language can advance one agenda and diminish another. So we looked at the issue of calling students subgroups and recognizing that if you call a student a subgroup, what is that saying to that student about where they're positioning in the world? And it's not that, I hope, the people that wrote the laws had this idea that we're gonna make some kids subgroups. Maybe they did, I don't know. But you don't have that conversation until you're in the room with people that are saying, I don't know the answers, but I want to talk about it and want to share together. So I think it's raising awareness, but also creating these, what we've created is networks, but creating the systems for them to then act on. So you tell the story, you overcome by that, but then it's a system that you're going to be pointing to really have change happen.
That's great. So what I hear you saying is we're going to have cohorts of superintendents focused on religious studies and religious literacy.
That sounds like
Write
a great
that
idea.
down, Ben. That's
You heard it here.
So here's the gatekeeper to the
We
gatekeepers.
are a nonprofit, so we have to
So
make sure. I just want to say we are not, but to your point, it's about the language. It's about how you communicate that.
well,
Because sometimes
we do
people
need,
hear,
seriously,
like
we do
you're saying,
need
Mark.
that kind of education you're talking about of superintendents. We do need it on this topic badly. Yeah. Okay, Kelly, obstacles.
To echo that, in my experience as a teacher, most of my colleagues don't even know that they're religiously illiterate. They don't know that religious studies is a field of inquiry at all. They've never even heard of it. So I would say, echoing what you were saying, of being louder and making sure that people are aware of this as a field of inquiry and know the importance of religious literacy for students. Most teachers I know teach what the textbook says and they think that's enough. And I think we're missing a huge opportunity to really instill in our students the skills necessary in order to navigate this diverse country that we live in, and knowing the chart of all the different founders and geographic locations and so on is not going to cut it. And I don't think that many teachers, in my experience, are aware of the damage that they can do by limiting their instruction to the most basic level.
Thank you. Mary, obstacles, you want to weigh in on that?
I'll just comment on one thing that I discussed at our table group this morning briefly. I think equity, educational equity, has been in a kind of a different conversational stream than religion and education. I think to get traction within the field of teacher education anyway, I think there's going to need to be better articulation between some of the core issues of equity that are preoccupying us in education, whether that be racial equity, gender equity, socioeconomic, I'm not sure what all, but I feel like it's almost like,
I would say that that's how it is in my district. We have a racial and diversity equity plan that doesn't mention religion at all.
yeah.
And that ties into
Right.
Mark's
But you
comments
have
about
vacation
politics.
December 25th through June.
Because if there's one, kind of third rail here, some religious views bump up against some of the movement for equity, right? And of course, nationally, the LGBTQ movement and the religious claims and that conflict infects everything, including public schools. And so one of the reasons why I think it's so hard to make that connection, I mean, in multicultural studies and so forth and so on, religious diversity was always the ignored diversity,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I think what you're talking about, Mary, is very important, how to get these together in a cultural moment when
And
some views are not acceptable and others are.
And I would even add that I actually think that religious and spiritual languaging and religious studies as a field actually has quite a lot to offer to equity issues in education. And this is something that, Kevin, you've been working on, and vice versa, new vocabularies. What happened if we had a serious conversation about the theological idea of purity in education and its curricular implications, just to give an example, and its equity implications for that matter.
I think it's a continuum too.
Yeah.
It's even just the fun, we were kind of on the side talking, the school calendar. I mean, there's so many messages that we send to students and to communities about what's valued, what's legitimate, whatever. And so we have to, and that maybe that's a part of this cohort that may create, but we have to be mindful of that, because I have to fundamentally believe that people aren't going out and saying we're going to exclude everybody when we create this calendar. I think they're just doing what they've always done because that's what they've always done, and it has never been challenged, and they've never sat at a table and had a conversation about, well, if we do it this way, who are we excluding and who are we giving privilege to? And so I think that's, in my mind, that's the low end of the continuum, and then there's a full-scale, literacy effort that needs to be unpacked as well.
Right, and a lot of religious groups have historically not felt any equity.
Mm-hmm.
The calendar is a Protestant baked-in calendar, right? And so, from the beginning. So in other words, there's lots of issues there for various religious groups, and they're now knocking on the door.
Yeah.
Where are we? Why are these people getting their holiday off? We're not, and so forth and so on. So there is, I think that, Mary, you've identified a really important, not just obstacle barrier, but also opportunity to bring these two conversations together. So you've been answering a number of the questions in different ways, and I want to get now a few minutes to the audience, but before we do that, I think one of the other big questions is what should we all be focused on, right? I mean, so of all these kinds of things that we could be doing, what are, in your mind, some of the priorities? Mary mentioned teacher education, which I think is a huge issue and a huge priority for me, but what are some that you have in your minds and why? Is it legislation, going back to the Project Blitz, or is that a nightmare? Should it be state curricular standards? Should it be textbooks? Should that be kind of more of a focus? Of course, teacher education, creation of new resources, school leaders, is that the priority? So these are all important. I mean, what do you see as kind of entry points for the future that are up there as top things to work on? We can't do it all at once, obviously. Anybody want to weigh in on that? What are your priorities?
What would it take? What would it take to really move the needle nationally on pre-service education and training? Right. I mean, I was thinking about that with a lot of the comments that teachers have made up here, and it came up in our earlier session. In-service training is great, and we talked about a lot of the fantastic in-service opportunities there are right now, but teachers are pulled in a lot of different directions. Districts are pulled in a lot of different directions. Not everybody gets that for religion, right? Most people don't. standardizing pre-service training. I'm not an education professor. I'm not in the K through 12 system. What would it take to move the needle on that? Because it seems to me that would be one of the biggest ways to change what's happening.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to know.
Yes.
Well, one way to start it immediately would be to make sure that the accrediting agencies would take it seriously. Because once they say you have to have a certain standard, then all of the teacher education programs have to meet it to be accredited. So if K, for example, which has got its own problems, I don't know if it will endure, but whatever replaces it, says that social studies teachers have to at least have 2 religious studies classes in their undergraduate curriculum, or the equivalent content. That would help. And then, within their teacher ed courses, that they have to have, so many, background preparations related to religious studies. That would help. So immediately, that's a national impact. So it would be up to NCSS to give that mandate to the accrediting body, and then it would be required nationwide. So that's something that could happen.
That's an excellent point, and that would make a huge difference. Sophia?
So I'm really glad you mentioned accreditation agencies in this, because that's one of the things I had wanted to talk about as a possible to remove some of the barriers. Accreditation agencies, the regional agencies, I don't know if there's any kind of central authority or oversight, and schools have an option to choose which accrediting agency they're going to work with. But speaking for CISNA, we also provide accreditation to Islamic schools. And we're in the process right now of revising our standards, and I'm really glad, Ben, that you put this program together, because our conversations about this have caused me to talk to the board about including in our CISNA standards a requirement that we can't be prescriptive, but we want to put in something about that schools have to engage with their local civic bodies and with other schools of different faiths. Like that's got to be there. And I don't know if we can get accreditation agencies at the table, but I think that would be great if we could. That's one more body to invite to this table and have a discussion, because it does make a huge difference when a school is required by an accreditation agency to have something in place. So it doesn't have to be very specific. You must have, a class on religious education, but somehow put in something about this kind of inclusiveness or interfaith dialogue or involvement with other, communities and so forth, and having diversity.
That's an excellent point. This accreditation issue is so important. I'm going to now go to the audience in a minute just to make sure priorities up here. I mean, Kelly, you mentioned, talking about accreditation, you mentioned that your master's was not recognized in Kentucky,
It was like as if I only had an undergraduate degree.
But it's also like, religion, that doesn't count. So the ignorance about religious studies at the state level. And so ironically, passing bills for more Bible courses and then turning around and saying, if you have biblical studies in your background, you can't count that towards certification. So that's another kind of real barrier here. If they don't even recognize your academic work as being a valid part of your teaching credential, we're in bad shape. A lot of people who have these religious studies backgrounds need to be in the public schools teaching, and if they can't get recognized, so yeah. Other priorities before I go to the audience, because I know the audience is going to be popping up and wanting to get in here, because we have real smart people out there with other things to say. Anything else you want to say about priorities?
I would just say, for me, the priority would be clarity on the why for religious studies in public education. I understand there's differences in different types of schooling, but clarity on the why for public education to have religious studies as a part. And then following that would be the what and the how, but kind of getting started on what's the why.
Okay, I did lots more questions, but I want to go to the audience with your comments and questions. Maha?
I wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Haynes, for the way that you started this panel, because you really brought it home by making it very real and immediately impactful to certain communities. When you started by talking about the fire bombings that are happening in synagogues and in mosques around the country, I mean, you brought it home. This is why this stuff is important. I think this responds to the why we need to do this. And there's a growing polarization and religious conflict, not just here in the United States, but around the world. There is something called Islamic Supremacy. There are people, within my community that believe that their religion is the truth and everybody else is not going to make it, right? And we have this among Christians. We have this among Hindus. We have it among Buddhists and other groups. So it's not just unique to the Christian community. Muslims just happen to be a minority here. So the why, I think, has been responded. Now, schools, I think, reflect the communities. District superintendents, educators reflect the community from which they come, which for me is the reason why you would want to involve the community in religious education, right? And I completely understand the arguments that have been made about the pitfalls and the importance of objectivity and situating religion in culture and making sure that you're pluralistic in the way that you talk about it and not sanitize it and all of that. And so my question is, how do you feel about involving the interfaith movement, which has grown exponentially since this president has come into office, and even after 9/11, how do you feel about engaging the interfaith community and fighting the battle with you, the academic educators, and really making the case for why this is important, even in states like Alabama and other states in the South where you do have a growing interfaith movement? So I envision Muslims, Jews, Hindus and Buddhists and all of them coming together and making the case to school districts and saying this is necessary, this is important, because our kids are suffering, our houses of worship are being firebombed, and on and on and on. So how do you feel about the interfaith movement involvement in this?
Any comments from the panel or others?
I think that's been happening in some communities already. So one of the things that we did, and I talked to you about how that one Islamic school didn't show up to the interfaith gathering of the students, what we realized is that we need to get the parents involved. And we had a social event for the adults from the Catholic schools, the Jewish schools, and the Muslim schools. We invited them to come with their spouses, some board members, some PTO members, some teachers, and just have dinner together. And we had a couple of students from each group just talk about their experiences, the ones who had attended some kind of interfaith dialogue. And that did a lot towards, bringing this understanding. But I think if you're talking about using interfaith dialogue or interfaith groups to advocate to legislators, that's, I think, something also happening recently in New York. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the substantial equivalency regulations, where the regulations have been on the books for years and years, but they realized that a small group said something, brought something up, and they felt that they needed to require the public school, the school superintendents, to go out to the non-public schools and evaluate them to ensure that they were substantially equivalent. And that's a huge thing for non-public schools. And in fact, for some of them, they said, we're not substantially equivalent. We're doing much better than some of the public schools are doing. But what that made happen there is brought the communities together to try to address this issue. So I think there has been, but again, these things are not centralized. We talked at my table about how there are some great programs in place and some resources that are out there. It's a matter of getting everything disseminated, right, in some areas.
One of the challenges with the interfaith community, and you know this because this is what you do, is people do think they then might have the right to say this is how our faith should be taught or our religion should be taught. and helping those communities understand that's not how it works, that the academic treatment of religion is how it's going to be done, is tough, because when they advocate, I have an example of an interfaith group that I won't mention where they are, but they went into the school districts in their region saying, here's how you teach Hinduism. Well, scholars of Hinduism did not agree. And of course, there are going to be disagreements, like in California, about how you teach a particular religion. Hinduism happened to be the firestorm out there. But all I'm saying is that engagement doesn't mean we get our way in public education, and that's challenging. Mary?
Well, this also leads to one of my questions, which I almost hesitate to say out loud in this room, because this seems to be an orthodoxy that's shared here. But this binary between devotional and academic approaches to religion in schools, it sounds like it has been very useful, for example, to you, John, and to teachers in general. But I don't think it's quite so simple. I think devotional approaches and academic approaches are motivated. I don't know. I know this has this framing has its uses. I also think it has its abuses. I think it's about power and academic worlds claiming power, and so I think that needs to be discussed or.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, because the First Amendment is often used to make sure we only teach a secular version of religious studies. And we don't, going back to the earlier conversation, we don't teach how people in those traditions actually see and experience the world. Yeah. That can be done in a First Amendment way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're talking about can be brought together. I mean, the teacher obviously under the First Amendment can't be devotional, but the teacher can really bring alive the devotional experience in these religions and take them seriously. But that's the step that is often not taken, right? So let me go back here, because I see a teacher waving his hand back there.
Well, I think to kind of address that question,
Chris.
and to kind of defend the work of the academics here, is you can talk about devotion, and I think good teachers do talk about that, but in a academic approach.
And I think as Mary's pushing us to unpack what that means, and I think sometimes it's very simplistic what it means.
Well, for example, me being the teacher, not owning where I'm coming from as a person of faith, as if I am the objective dispenser of knowledge.
Right.
But that's just a little example.
Right.
I think this gets into part of why we talk about the importance of situatedness, and that part of what we're working towards, and a fundamental component of religious literacy, is being able to articulate, understand, analyze these different perspectives. But that's still very different than standing and putting forth from a devotional perspective. And then we're in First Amendment issues. So this distinction, again, isn't about not presenting devotional perspectives. And it's also not to say that people can't own and recognize, and students can't come from their own devotional perspectives, but it is very clear about where teachers have to present material from. And that's where we are, right, in terms of what's legal, what's constitutionally sound.
Mary, I've heard this concern from people also. Does it help to say, instead of academic versus devotional, does it help address some of those concerns to say non-sectarian versus devotional, or is non-sectarian itself vague and ambiguous? Because then it's not saying that devotional is not academic, because there certainly is academic devotional study.
Right.
Right? Is that part of the?
Yeah.
So that's interesting, though, because all of our sound bites are academic versus devotional. I was just looking through, again, through some of our documentation.
I think the sticking point is on the claims to objectivity. I think that's where you're getting at, right? Not that you can't take an academic approach and call it religious studies or whatever, but the idea that there's a neutral, objective stance in which this can be undertaken, and that academics have it, but people who practice that faith do not have it. That's where you're getting, and there are different ways to deal with that, I think, but that's might be unavoidable.
I mean, Warren Nord and I made the argument that we teach the discipline of religious studies. We don't teach the subject. And I think what you're talking about is teaching the discipline. What we inherit from the academy, and it's all through a secular lens, rather than teach the subject where you have a variety of ways of seeing the world given seriousness. And of course, under the First Amendment, teachers may say where they're coming from. They can't give a sermon, but they can say. But I think in my view, what you're pointing to is a very serious problem, because we often use the academic treatment as a way of saying we're not going to allow in the deeply religious ways people experience and see the world. And that has, I think, infected our way of doing religious studies in public schools. I'm just going to say it.
Yeah.
John brings in parents, and I think that this is a link to what we just said. You know, I think one of the great ways in which to go forward is to let parents in on this and let parents understand what we're doing, because they can be our best advocates in a school district. You want to say something? Did you already do that? Talk about parent briefly, but so for me, that's a very powerful model.
Sure, and I can be concise about it. I was receiving year after year, and I had previously shared and I can stand up here. This is year 10, and the first 5 years I was receiving very similar, honest concerns, questions that I kept having to answer through emails and phone calls. And it was the same ones over and over and over again. And so that's where I just had this idea to why not open it up to engage in the conversation and do so in adult ways, and to talk about things that matter most. And many of the parents, and for those who I didn't share with, I also do a 3-week unit on atheism, agnosticism, and secular humanism. And so that's how we end our second semester, to really just try and give this wide range of experience. And parents, I found them showing up for their own education as much as the education of what their sons and daughters were learning. And that community building really helped.
Can you just say something about what you do about First Amendment stuff? Can you talk about what you do about First Amendment stuff?
Oh, First Amendment stuff, sure. I mean, we spent 3 weeks, and I remember the exercise that I learned from you is, so I teach the kids how to get me fired in day 2. And so, I mean, and I remember that as we take the 16 words of the First Amendment, our Establishment Clause, and pretty much demonstrate and get them all excited that their 2 words are free exercise and my 2 words are no establishment. And we immediately situate that we're playing different games. And my job is to support them in their engagement in their study, but at no point, endorse my own. So no elevation, no denigration, et cetera. And so what we do is we really seek to make them own their citizenship and to really deepen our democracy. And if you're not afraid of it, it is sort of fun when they get fired up to see if I would ever cross that line where they could try and get me fired. Thanks, man.
Great exercise.
Okay, are there either questions or comments for the panel, or something you want to say about the future that has not been said? Yeah. Anything else? Yes, Mark.
Can I emphasize how important your point is about the atheists, agnostics, and nuns? One recent survey says there are 23% of the population now this year, as big a group as evangelicals, as big a group as Catholics. And I know my experience is that many people who are at least organized atheists bristle at our talk of religious literacy as promoting religion in general over non-religion. So finding ways to talk about religious diversity that explicitly acknowledges those who, for whatever reason, opt out, I think is actually important civically, pedagogically, and also politically.
Yes, Bernadine.
I was going to say, I keep thinking about a course I had to take, and when I was finishing, I have my PhD is education policy. And one of the final courses you have to take is ways of knowing. And all of everything that you read in Ways of Knowing is extremely like polarizing. There are things that whole countries have gone to war over, you know, Machiavelli, you name it. But we have to read all of these because we're kind of going out into the world as these philosophers, so to speak, that can now create new knowledge and new meaning. And for my university, it was important for us to go outside of what we were seeking. So my track was ed policy. So I was following everything on Capitol Hill. I was following everything, like I was able to pick and choose for a lot of my study, the type of work that I wanted to do, some of which I think your experience. But when I sat in this course and I had to read things that I was offended by, I had to read things that I was ashamed to know that there were people that thought that way and were leading countries and organizations, it helped me, I hope, to be a better leader as I moved, you know, through the teaching in public schools and even now my work at AASA. So it keeps coming back in my head as a way to position religious studies in schools as this way of understanding, and I don't want to put religion in a negative context ever, I shared my personal background, but a way of understanding that in order to move forward as a nation, we have to fully communicate and connect with people that are not like us. We live in we live in segregated communities. We go to my church, everyone in my church looks like me. I don't think Christianity is a black religion, I don't think so, but my church, you hear people say a black church. And so because we're segregated as just people, even beyond race, it's important as you all lead this work, and for me as kind of an outsider from the scholarly world of it, to encourage you to ensure that you're communicating the reasons why someone should endorse or support, but also recognizing that we also ourselves have to understand others and even understand ourselves through the lens of others so that we can move forward as a nation, as a democracy, because if we don't, we might undermine everything that we've tried to build, you know, since the establishment of this country. So I just felt like I needed to share that example of a course, but it was positioned in a way that really stretched my understanding of everything that sits with me even today in rooms like this.
Thank you, Bernadine. Well, as we're heading down to the final minutes of this panel, and then we're going to go into small groups, we have not really said much about allies, right? Others that we touched on a little bit, and Maha brought up how religious communities can be a part of this conversation. But, you know, there are libraries, there are YMCAs, you know, so what is the role? I mean, we can't do it all in schools, and so do you want to speak a little bit about that? And Sophia, you touched on it, but you might want to say also more about talking about alliances. What's the role of religious schools in this, and even in relation to what public schools are trying to do? Do you see a role? I mean, we instead of talking about religious schools over here and public schools over here and religious literacy, it seems to me that they share a interest in getting it right in both settings, right? One has to get it right or get sued. The other can choose to get it right. Mm-hmm. So you might want to say a little bit more about how you see the role in this conversation of religious schools in relation to public schools or just in general. And then any of you who want to speak about any allies you think or you found that we need to engage to make sure that we're moving forward and not trying to do it all alone?
I think faith-based schools are uniquely positioned to be able to offer the kind of that engagement that we were talking about, that Maha mentioned as well, is if we can share for example, the Islamic schools that we're going to encourage through our standards to be reaching out to local schools, whether they're faith-based schools, independent schools, or public schools, to have some sort of dialogue at different grade levels. And I'll give you an example of what we did at a school I was at in New Jersey. The second graders we had a partnership, I guess you'd call it, with a Friends school. And our second graders would visit the second graders at the Friends School one year, and they would just have snack together, they would play outside together, they would do an activity, all with, with adult supervision. Then the following year, the Friends School would come and visit those same second graders, now they're in third grade, and do something else similar, but based, age appropriate. By the time they were in middle school, in sixth grade, they would observe prayer. When the Friends School came, they would observe it, and then one of the teachers would talk about the ritual and just kind of explain. And the teacher would also mention, and again, different schools of thought within Islam, they may pray a little bit differently. Some of what they recite might be different, their actions and so on might be different. And then when our kids went to the Friends School, they would go to the meeting room or the meeting house, I'm not sure what they call it, and just observe that. So doing things like that, and something that we've recently, we're working on doing in New Jersey with some of the schools, is shared professional development. So we're talking about having teachers from the Jewish school, the Catholic schools, Islamic schools, the public school, come together and have the professional development be provided by a third party, and it can be on anything, classroom management or curriculum mapping, whatever it might be, leadership training, but just getting them in the room together. And so these teachers talking to each other, which then goes into the parents and the students being more involved as well. It's just one example of what we can do.
That's a great example. Yes.
The Unitarian Universalists, they're small, but they've got
Small but mighty.
the Unitarian Universalists are a very small group, but they have loud voices, and they've spent a lot of time working on, living together in diversity. And you could really get them involved in this. And there's also this group called the Fourth R. Some of you are probably familiar with it, but it's reading, writing, arithmetic, and the fourth R is religion, right? And they have a publication, and they would probably be interested, West Star. So that might be a group that would really help. And then, we're talking about how the Christian right has co-opted some of the hard work that you've done. We need to get the progressive, Christian community involved, because they tend to be more open to diverse religious communities, and they could get on board. The Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, they do world history, world religions in their religious ed courses within their churches. So we could have them as supporters. Public libraries, of course. So those are some of the partners that I think we could tap.
Thank you, Bea. That's very helpful.
Hi. I would actually stay within education and look for partnerships there. So, for instance, besides the Superintendents Association, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, National Association of Elementary School Principals, NCTE, which I know you're with. I mean, those kinds of groups that start, presenting at those conferences, start sending toolkits to members of those groups, because just as, there are some places that exemplary work is being done, if you can start having more places where that's happening, that's what I mean by bottom up. It will drive demand. If, hey, this is working in the neighboring district, let me try it in mine. But working through those groups, because they do have a lot of influence over what happens in schools, including the National Association of School Boards.
And of course, our big ally, NCSS. I wanted David to comment on something that's unusual, I think. I've never heard of it before. And this builds on what Bea was just saying about how you engage religious groups, maybe different kinds of religious group churches and so forth that haven't been. And David actually, before he came to work with us in the Georgia 3Rs project, was involved in a released time program in Georgia. And the released time program decided, with the support of the churches in the community, to do an academic release time. Now that's interesting because release time is permissible in any school district that wants to do it, and mostly it's faith formation. People are released to do, you know, whatever, Bible study or whatever. But in this community, I'm actually answering, I'm speaking, and as David would also say.
Right. So thank you, Charles. The nonprofit I worked for in Gainesville, Georgia, was founded in the 60s to do devotional release time education. And when I came in, I told them that wasn't my background and I wasn't really comfortable doing that, and I thought that actually they would be better off if they took a First Amendment and academic approach. And they were really happy to do that. And I think part of it was that it was founded by an Episcopalian, Catholic, Methodist, and Cooperative Baptist churches. So they already had an ecumenical kind of attitude and background. But what I ended up kind of arguing, and then was proven through the time I was there, was that if you take an academic approach and you are, so for example, I did not tell any of my students throughout all of my teaching what my faith tradition was or my background, and they would guess randomly all the time. When you take that approach, it garners real interest. And so the organization I worked for went from having 15 kids in a class to having wait lists, and not being able to provide enough. So we ran out of space and we ran out of hours in the day. And so that was a really great experience. I still had parents come back to me and say, are you going to turn my student into an atheist or an agnostic or whatever? And as we've talked before, not only is there the real actual academic research that Emil has done, but you know, that you were talking about before, Sophia, and then what I experienced also is I polled students the same kind of thing. How do you feel about religion at the end of the course? And 72% of my students said, I feel more positive about religion. And I think I had one student in the 2 years that I taught say, this makes me think that religion is bad, right? Like that was, and that's going to happen. But anyway, I think finding partnerships like that is really important. Another kind of partnership or ally I'll mention from Georgia is the Carlos Museum on Embry's campus. They are the premier art and artifact museum in the Southeast, and they see over 50,000 public school students a year. And I met with them because their docents didn't know what to do. And they're not bound by First Amendment rules, but they have students coming in every day, and they want to make sure that they're doing this right. And so we've been working with them and doing training for them and their docents, and now they have a belief, behavior, belonging tour that's part of the work that they do. So there are organizations like that as well that are kind of secondary that public schools are already engaged with, that we can find spaces with them as well.
That's a wonderful reminder that art museums are fantastic opportunities for religious literacy, and linking them with public schools could do so much to help public schools teach about religions in ways that are so rich and exciting, but involve these great museums. And of course in Washington we have endless ones, but that's a wonderful model for finding ways to address religious literacy out of the box, because it's not going to be that much room in the curriculum for more religious studies. There's just not going to be. And adding religious studies electives is tough. You know, Fairfax County has a lot of religious studies electives, in Montgomery County, but that's rare. And how do you get more, short of Steve's suggestion that we require it, which I agree with, but you know, until only one school district in America so far requires religious studies, that's Modesto. So we're a long way away from getting there, but that may be something to work for. But I'm saying there's just not enough room in the school day and the school framework to do the kinds of things we're talking about, so we need to find other ways. Is that your hand, Maha?
I was curious to find out how the people that actually teach about religion in academic environment, how do you deal with controversial issues? For example, you know, where do you stand on, where does Christianity stand on homosexuality? Where does it stand on abortion? where does it stand on the salvation of other religions? I know how I do it in an academic sort of environment, but I'm just curious for the academics here that do this work. How do you do it without content, without knowing what the spectrum of views are in the community? It's not a question of skill. You really have to know what the answers are, right? So,
Anybody want to comment on that? I mean, dealing with controversial issues like that and different religious perspectives. And this is like a bit of a landmine in some school districts.
I think that this is where the notion of skills separate from content is a misnomer. You can't do this without content. The question is framing the correct content to complement the question you're asking. So we would begin with, if a teacher were saying, hey, I want to talk about where Christianity stands with respect to abortion. We'd begin with the notion that, okay, well, let's look at this principle that we have as a foundational principle, which is that there's inherent diversity within religion. So we're not going to ask from the beginning, where does Christianity stand with respect to abortion? We're going to begin by thinking about what particular conversation do we want to structure around different approaches to abortion within different Christian communities, and ideally how those have changed over time, and how those changes over time are connected to cultural, political shifts within. Presumably this is getting complicated, so let's stick within the United States, or let's stick within a region of the United States and look at those conflicts and how they come into relationship with each other. And so right there you're saying, okay, there's a lot of content that's involved. So let's back up now and figure out how we're going to frame that content. What of that content do we want to dive deeply into? Are we doing this through media representation? Are we doing this through looking at issues around litigation? Are we doing this in terms of looking at bioethics? How are we framing this? Is this in a history class? Is this in an ethics class? Right, and all of that's going to determine how you're going to craft that content. And then there's questions for the teacher to ask. If this is going to be a central unit, what are the various theological positions that are relevant that students need to understand? Is there historical language? Is there conceptual language? Is there dogmatic language with respect to the traditions that we're in? And then we need to make sure that we're not just talking about what traditions are teaching top down. If we're talking about the Catholic Church, we may want to look at what's being taught top down, and where do women in this community stand, and where do women of different ages in this community stand, and are there economic divisions? And so you're crafting a unit that's bringing in a serious degree of content, both with respect to the tradition and with respect to the context that you're operating in. And so you have to, this is something you can do on the fly, right? You have to step back and say, okay, I'm spending time developing this curriculum in order to do this in a rich and dynamic way. And I think the other piece, and I'm looking at John because we've spent so much time talking about this together over the past couple of years, is also how do you do this in a way that allows students from different backgrounds or with different abilities to have entry into this. So there's another scaling piece in there, which is you need content that's accessible if you're doing this in a public school to a range of reading abilities. And also to students, some of whom are going to find some of this material unsettling, which is fantastic, right? You're creating an environment in which they're learning the discursive practices to talk about this stuff. But the fact that you're doing it in such a diverse way gives them a way to situate themselves and understand that there really are these very different perspectives.
Thank you. What an excellent way to capture the challenge ahead to get this right. Emil, you wanted to say something? You need to follow up, and she wanted to follow up on that, and then I'll come to you, Emil. And then I'm going to wrap up, Ben, I promise.
It was probably an easy volley for a Harvard professor. I think most of the questions that will come at teachers is actual cases that are happening in the country or that they've read about in the media, and they will ask you from that perspective. And then the response from the kid might be that, well, that's not what I am taught at home, or that's not what the Bible teaches, or that's not my understanding of my religion, and so forth. Without content, I mean, you can, I think your approach is exactly the correct approach, talking about the spectrum of views that exist in any community. But an ordinary teacher who is not a religious studies, a student or a professor, most of them are not going to be able to do that easily. And they'll probably resort to the traditional answer that is given, that they're aware of. And I think that's why content becomes incredibly important, and a relationship with a community that could help in the religious studies might be a path that one should consider. But to expect a teacher to be able to respond to questions as you just did, or on these very complicated and important issues that are trigger issues and very provocative issues, I think is taking a lot of risk.
Well, that's why the superintendents are nervous, Bernadine. So Emil, where are you?
Charles, I'm sorry. I would just add, I think the most important thing is that when we speak about religion or any religious group, that the value, whether it's the worth, the merit, the value, all of that is removed from it. And so whatever the answers are, whatever text you use, it needs to reinforce something that can be traced back to evidence-based research. I mean, I don't know how you would define, what is quality curriculum materials, but I think that's the opportunity for such a group like this, because educators will look for answers, and they will find open source materials, they'll find YouTube videos, and they will put together an answer. Educators I know that love and care about their children, they're going to find the answer. And so I think it should be a responsibility of an organization or group of people to ensure that when they go looking, it's there. And that's something we talked about earlier on with our group, our team of 3, about the publishers and what role they play in making sure that the content can be consumed in a way that is free from bias, free from judgment, free from any, pointing someone in a different moral direction than what they bring to the classroom.
Thank you. Emil, you're going to get the last comment, and then I get the last word, because I'm the moderator, not you. So,
yeah, so Charles said that's how it's always been, right? I think in a higher education context, to speak to Maha's point, it's important to point out that religion and Christianity in particular aligns well in some ways with social justice and equity demands. For instance, not only talking about the social gospel, for instance, or about the civil rights movement, but also if we look at what Jesus and Paul have to say about women and the role of women, which is not only radical for their context, but radical for our context. And in a higher education context, you can do that, for instance, by pointing out that the book of Timothy, where Paul supposedly says not great things about women, is not written by Timothy. Now, of course, well, right. I mean, of course, right. I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, in a public school context, right, there's a huge question about whether you can do that and how you can do that.
yeah, and that's what we're going to be pushing the number of years ahead. And I mean, if we had lots of John teaching in our school system who has this experience and background, and that goes back to, do we require religious studies of everyone who's going to be teaching in a subject area that has a great deal about religion? Do we push for that? Do we make sure that your certification is recognized if you have a religious studies background and not ignored and considered, I don't know what, not real?
Not there.
Not there.
Might as well not have it.
Not happen. So yeah, so these are I think these last comments have kind of brought together a lot of the barriers, obstacles we started the session with, and finding ways to address them. So, before I thank the panel, I just want to say that I'm old, so I've been around this a long time, and I've seen this come and go. And I don't want to be negative about this. I want to be optimistic. I am optimistic. But I have seen in the 70s that huge surge of interest in teaching about religions in public schools, bouncing off the Supreme Court's decision on prayer and Bible reading. Many universities and colleges got religious studies departments out of that surge, and they still are there. So there were lasting impacts of that wave. And the wave kind of went into public education. Harvard Ed School did some studies, some materials for schools on teaching about religion, and Florida. Pennsylvania had a statewide effort to do religious studies in the schools. Religious studies of the West was there first. They were going to do religious studies in the East, but it died before it happened. In other words, there was this wave, and then it died. And then in the 80s, when we started the First Amendment framework and the consensus guidelines, another wave began. And California changed its standards to include more teaching about religions. The textbooks followed suit. And lots of the consensus guidelines gave people a safe harbor to do this. And so we saw kind of a wave, but it was more, let's mention religion more often kind of thing. And I'm going to simplify it, but I think we plateaued at that, you know. Well, we can do it, but we'll put it a little bit more in textbooks and so forth. Today's discussion raises the question that I think Mary used the expression in the beginning, or maybe it was Kelly. No, it was you. Taking religion seriously. Mm-hmm. So getting it mentioned more in textbooks is not such a difficult thing. We've gotten that. Getting it mentioned even in state standards, it wasn't even in there in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. At least it's mentioned. But how do you really get serious treatment? You know, deep understanding, given all the obstacles we've talked about, and given that we believe that it's essential for people to have this kind of education, not only to be well-educated people, but for our civic arrangement and for living together with our differences in the 21st century and beyond. If we do think it's essential, and I think most of us do, maybe all of us in this room, then the serious treatment has got to be the next wave. But I'm just reminding us that the waves come and they go. So getting it part of the accreditation or part of the teacher education program or part of whatever the structures are is our next great challenge in this arena. And I think we've heard, you know, just this afternoon from people who give me great hope that we can do this. We can do this. I mean, there are lots more allies today. There are lots more, you know, ways of opening doors than there ever have been in spite of the politics. The politics make it tough, as Mark has pointed out. But if we're going to live together in the future across all of our differences in one of the most religiously diverse societies in the world, we have got to learn about one another. And so that's a way of thanking not only the panel for your wonderful contribution, but for all of you for the work you're doing to make this happen. So thank you very much.
All right, so I'm Steve Prothero from Boston University. I'm really delighted to be here. And all day I've been listening and kind of annoyed at the same time because I'm thinking I'm supposed to respond to all these things everyone's saying. And as you might have noticed, there wasn't a lot of agreement about too much. So that's my goal, is to try to tell you what I heard and then pose some questions. All of the different kind of book projects I've worked on in my now long career, almost as long as Charles Haynes's career, I always had to learn something new. I didn't realize this until it was sort of retrospective. I did a book about the first American to convert to Buddhism, and I had to learn about Sri Lankan religious history, and I knew nothing about that. And then I did a book about cremation. I thought I would do a cheerful topic, and I had to learn about the history of American public health, which I knew nothing about, to write about cremation in America. And then when I did my religious literacy book, I had to learn about the history of American education, which I knew absolutely nothing about. So I really admire those of you in the room who have expertise in both of these areas. That can be hard to come by. Regarding the conversation about marketing and branding, I thought I would start with how I make the case for religious literacy when I speak about religion in public. And I do think it's really important to not, if you're an academic, to try not to talk like an academic when you do this, this kind of task. I think you need to assume that in many cases people will only listen to one sentence or maybe one phrase or maybe a paragraph depending on their attention span. So I think it's really useful to have keywords, to have key phrases, to have key sentences that you can return to. So I would really second, and I think I would say that I think one of the main things I'm hearing, and maybe the main thing I'm hearing today, that folks can agree on is that there needs to be some work and some conversation and then some consensus and then some utilization of shared language, and that would be very helpful in stimulating the demand side of the equation here that people have been talking about. We need more demand from parents, from superintendents, from teachers, from students for the kind of courses and materials that we've been talking about. So one of the phrases I use is religion matters. This happens to be the title of my forthcoming textbook, so this is a plug for my forthcoming textbook, which will make my editor, Roby Harrington, happy. He told me before, I don't care what you say, but you just have to say religion matters, so I'm saying that. That's a joke. Roby did not actually say that. But this is useful language. Religion matters. You know, I think we tend to think religion is this private thing. A lot of people think religion is a private matter. And so what does it matter? It matters to individuals, maybe. But the case we're making is religion isn't just something that matters to religious people. Religion isn't just something that matters to religious communities. Religion has force in the world. It has political effects. It has economic effects. It powers a lot of art that we look at. And so religion matters. It matters to individuals. It matters to religious communities. And it matters politically and economically and socially. And therefore, whether or not you're religious, doesn't matter whether or not you are religious, you need to know something about religion. It's not, we're not trying to get you to be Christian or Muslim or anything. We're just trying to, if you want to understand the world, if you want to understand the United States, you need to know something about religion. This seems to be a really clear case. You can make it in the United States by pointing out that our recent elections have largely turned, one could argue, on the way different religious groups went in the election. This is not a controversial, weird idea that religious studies people make. This is a claim that pollsters make all the time. And similarly, politicians refer all the time nowadays to the Bible, to Christianity, to Jesus. How are we, as members of this democracy, to engage with these politicians if we don't understand and are able to critique or agree with the things that they say? And so religious studies is preparation for democracy. Religious studies is preparation for active engagement in our society. Why? Because the United States is one of the most religious countries on earth, and it has more Christians on earth than any other society. We need to understand these people. We need to understand their ideas, whether or not we're Christians or otherwise. So the line that I use repeatedly in the media is, you may or may not be religious, but you can't understand the world without knowing something about religion. You can use this. You don't have to quote me. You know, you may or may not be religious, but you can't understand the world without knowing something about religion. So that's on this, in terms of marketing. Religion matters. It's a pretty simple idea. I think a lot of people can get on board with this. Now, in terms of religious literacy, I think that I would observe that we have different understandings of religious literacy. And not only do we have different understandings of religious literacy, but some of us don't think religious literacy is a good idea. Because religious literacy is about memorizing names and dates and facts and 7 sacraments and 5 pillars and silly things like that aren't really about what religious studies are about. So I would argue that we should get behind this language of religious literacy, and we should forget our quibbles about whether this is a good idea, but that may or may not be possible. It may be more possible if we can agree that no one who proposes religious literacy, including myself, thinks it's about memorizing names and dates and knowing what the seventh Catholic sacrament is and what the fifth pillar of Islam is. So I think those are typically, those kinds of critiques are typically not really paying attention to those of us who make arguments for religious literacy. As for myself, I think content is a part of religious literacy. I think religious literacy also involves three other things. It involves a comparative approach, so you're not doing religious literacy if you're talking about just one religion. And it involves some kind of empathetic understanding where you're able to bracket out your own secularity or your own religious commitments for methodological purposes at certain times as you're trying to make sense of the beliefs or behaviors of other people. And it involves some kind of critical engagement. It is not just look at how fabulous religion is. Isn't religion such a wonderful thing? I mean, you only have to be in 6th grade or maybe less to know that that's a silly idea. And the only people who make it are people who write books about religion or teach in universities in religious studies programs. But it's just not true. Religious people do really bad things in the name of religion. And so part of religious literacy, I think, is critical engagement with these religious traditions. Okay, so on to reporting more of what I heard today and posing a few questions. One impression is it's really heartening to see how far we've come. I remember I was in a group 25 years ago at the National Humanities Center in Raleigh, Durham area, and it was a group of religious studies scholars who got together, and we were talking about, well, how can we talk more effectively in public about what we do? And I remember someone there, I don't remember who it was, said, oh, we should talk about religious literacy. They talk about that in math and science. We should do that. And the folks in the room were like, oh, that's a cool idea. I haven't heard of that before. We should do that. And so this is a relatively recent idea. It's now all over the place. That's cool. That's useful. 10 years ago, at that 2007 date we heard about, I guess it's not 10 years ago, I guess that's 12 years ago now, there are very few people equipped to be engaged in this conversation with high school teachers about how to do this in the public schools. When my book came out, I got all these emails from people about, oh, I want to teach this course. Tell me who, connect me with all these, who can help me. And I basically just kept my email list. And someone would write me from Dallas and say, I want to teach the course. And someone would write me from Chicago and say, I'm teaching this course. And I would email them back, and no, you should talk to those people. That's very unsophisticated technology. But now here in this room, we have teachers and administrators and representatives of all these NGOs and nonprofits and authors and philanthropists and members of faith-based organizations. There's a lot of teacher training going on. I mean, I remember when I wrote my book, all I could write about was the program at Harvard and the program at UC Chico with Bruce. That's not the case anymore. There's also lots of intrepid high school teachers who I have to say, my deepest bow to all of those in the room goes to, not to Ben for putting this on, which I give a half bow to Ben, but the deep bow goes to the high school teachers who are doing this against all odds and, based on their own, commitments and, scurrying around to figure out how to do this without the proper resources or the proper support. This is really amazing to me to see and really, really heartening. That said, there's still a huge gap between the standards that are written by states and national standards, which tend to be good in general on religion, and what's actually happening in the classroom, which continues to be rather minimal. The Pew US Knowledge Surveys that came out in 2010 and again just a few months ago, 2019, are sobering in terms of what Americans know, have basic information in terms of what they know about the world's religions. A few issues to flag of what I was hearing today. One is that religious studies is not exactly a field It may not even be a discipline. I remember talking with Roby about my textbook. I won't say the name of it again because that would just be super cheesy, but my forthcoming textbook, we were talking about what would be in it. And Norton has done all these textbooks, US history, sociology, economics. Those fields have no debates about what's in the textbook. There's no uproar. There's no. It's like everybody knows what you have to teach in econ. Everybody knows what you have to teach in intro to psych. Everybody knows what you have to teach in US history. Everybody knows how you do it. You go chronologically from the beginning to the end of US history. You hit the key points. Everybody knows what the key points are. That's not true in religious studies. There's no agreement at all that Intro to Religion should be about the world's religions. There's no agreement about that. There's no agreement that Intro to Religion should be about theory. There's no agreement about that. There's no agreement even in this room about whether, to what extent, religious studies education should be about teaching basic information about the world's religions, or whether it should be doing something else. This makes this conversation very difficult. How do you push for religious studies education when there's no agreement about what religious studies education is? Harvard's Religious Literacy Project emphasizes questions of power, peace, and conflict. We heard from Sarah Bin today. They take a cultural studies approach that is a little bit reminiscent of the critical legal studies approach taken by some scholars of law. This isn't the way that I do it. I do religious literacy more historically. Some are worried that religious literacy focuses too much on facts and on data. John talked about concerns about trivia on testing. Sarah Bin talked about superficial overviews of the world's religions in making her argument for how we should drop down into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre rather than trying to understand Christianity somehow more broadly. This also informs Harvard's case studies approach that privileges the specific over the general. As someone who has worked on a superficial overview of the world's religions, which includes all sorts of trivia, I will say, again, point out again, that we don't really have agreement in this room on this question. I do have a commitment that I think is defensible, that all human thought and communication requires both generalization and specifics, that there is no thinking without abstraction. There is no conversation about the specifics of Christian life without a conversation about Christianity. It just doesn't make sense. Because you don't know what the topic that is being diversified is unless you're willing to make a generalization about what Christianity is. So this is another place where we disagree. I think we disagree also about whether religious literacy education is a kind of character education. I think most people in the room agree with that. In other words, that this will make us more tolerant, it will make us more moral, it will make life on earth better in some way. Charles Haynes said this when he talked about religious literacy as an essential ingredient in the survival of democracy, and Maureen Costello talked about religious studies as a kind of identity formation that, according to her organization's name, is something that teaches tolerance, that is committed to justice. I am more sanguine about this, both for strategic and also for intellectual reasons. I think that to the extent that religious studies mimics talking points of left Democrats in the United States, it risks being understood by funders, by politicians, as a left-wing project rather than a purely educational project. And I also know that sometimes people kill one another over religion, not because they don't know each other, but because they know each other quite well. And what they've learned about each other they hate, and therefore they kill one another. So I don't think that knowledge in and of itself about religions is a kind of a cure-all. We disagree also about whether to focus on standalone world's religions courses, which I'm partial to, or to focus on integrating religion into the broader curriculum. This seems to be a really, really important strategic question. And I see the argument for, well, it's too hard to get religious studies into the high school curriculum, world religions course, or even Bible as literature courses. Let's just try to integrate it into the curriculum. I get that because you can sneak it in that way. But I also know that one thing we've learned from higher education and that we know is that the only way a new discipline really gets established and has any voice is it has to be institutionally manifested. And that's in departments, in majors, in minors, in courses. We disagree also about how to mix the emic and the edict, the insider and the outsider voices. We heard some speakers today talking about the importance of getting religious practitioners in the classroom, have them talk about their own religious commitments. I don't say faith, by the way, because you can agree or disagree with this, this nerdism, but faith is a Protestant word. Faith traditions is a Protestant way of saying religions. I don't think we should use that term as a generic term, but that's an aside. We talk about this a lot in my department about, do we bring in outside speakers? Do we send students into religious communities to report back? What do we do? So that's another tactical area, or maybe pedagogical and methodological area where we disagree. And so for all these reasons, I particularly resonated with what Ben said at the beginning about the importance of creating a center of gravity in a field. And he said so that people don't feel like they are alone. I think this is really, really important for high school teachers who do feel they're alone to have a sense that there's a center of gravity toward which they could be pulled. But I also think that, again, strategically, insofar as there's a hope that folks in this room and organizations that they represent could get together for collective action, there needs to be an agreement on what the center of gravity is. And I think that conversation about what that is would be very useful. And I would also observe that as that conversation goes forward, and if it goes forward in an actionable way, that there will be some people who don't want to be attracted to that center of gravity. Because the commitments that the folks who are revolving around that center of gravity have are not their own. And I do think that one virtue and one vice of religious studies is that we haven't really agreed on what we do. This makes for a wonderful cacophony. It makes for very, very confused undergraduates, which may be good, depending on whether you value confused undergraduates or whether you value less confused undergraduates. Anyway, I think that I would really second the motion to really think about this center of gravity issue, but I think it needs to be thought about in a clear-eyed way. But that means making choices. One more point on marketing. It's really interesting to me how much the public is interested in religion, and almost never from religious studies scholars. What's the most important religion book right now? Number 2 on the bestseller list. I just saw it in the airport. Harari's book, Sapiens. What does this book argue? The book argues that religion created civilization. Seems to be an important argument that we could be using in marketing what we do. One of the most read books of the last 5 years. When does civilization start? When do we move beyond being hunters and gatherers? When we start to tell stories to one another that resonate enough that we start to gather collectively around these stories. What are the most powerful of these stories? Religious stories. This is their best-selling book. And I think we could capitalize more on those kinds of resources. Okay, so the priorities that I heard, one is, and that really resonated with me, beyond the ones I've mentioned, is this idea of a clearinghouse organized by a coalition of the groups in this room that would be a centralized website where high school teachers could go and they could find materials and they could also have conversations. This seems to me such a no-brainer. It's not big money. I think the money could be raised for this very quickly. It would be so helpful. I asked Kelly at our table, you know, what do people do, what high school teachers do when they're looking for resources? Do they just Google stuff? And she's like, yeah, we just Google religious education resources, Google machine, answer, you know. That's what we do. There should be a clearinghouse that when you Google that, you go to the clearinghouse. And there should be a smart computer person who messes around with the algorithms to make sure that, you know, that's where people go. This seems to me just such a great idea. I would love when people write to me about, well, what can I do? I could just say, just go to that website. So questions to the broader group. I would say, what do you really think are the 2 or 3 key goals? I know when I became chair of my department, a prior chair said, just try to do 3 things. You have 6 years, just try to do 3 things. I think that's really important. Don't try to do 10 things. You know, try to do 3 things. I think that would be really great. What is the best way to create a center of gravity for this field? Another question. And then I'll just close on this, and this is a sort of note on hope, because I think it is important in doing work like this, where, you know, we heard Charles say, like, oh, I remember in the 70s we did this, and it was a big thing, and then in the 80s there was this, and, you know, I mean, this has been going on for a while. And I do myself feel both really spirited and dispirited, depending on what side of the equation that I'm looking at. So I think it's really important to be hopeful. And I think that hope for me is located in a couple places. One is that curriculums do change. So they are highly inertial, high school curricula. But they do change. And the story that I have told to a couple people in this room is when I was in high school, when I was in middle school, I took woodworking and I took metalworking. This is what the boys took, by the way. No girls took any of these courses. Girls took home economics. This shows you that I'm not as young as I look, you know. This isn't true anymore. My high school does not teach home ec anymore. My high school does not teach metalworking. My high school does not teach woodworking. It doesn't do it. My high school did not have computer science. Now it does. It has computer science classes. And so what's on the curriculum changes, but the way that it changes is from the demand side. It doesn't change because people write curricula, which need to happen. It changes because people demand new forms of knowledge. And so I think a focus on that, pushing that demand of new forms of knowledge among students and teachers and parents and the general public is really crucial. And I'm really glad to hear from Eric at Boston College. Is Eric still here? Yeah. Oh, there he is, yeah. Eric Owens. That there is a course at Wellesley, in Wellesley, Massachusetts, 6th grade required course, like in Modesto, required course in the world's religions at the 6th grade level. So these are hopeful matters. And then my last reason for hope is all of you in this room, and starting with Ben and his colleagues who have organized this important and wonderful conference, and with all of you who are here, taking time off when you could be, you know, preparing your daily fantasy football teams for upcoming Sunday. You're here in the room instead. So that also really gives me hope. So thank you for giving me this time. It looks like it's 5 o'clock, so I will stop. Thank you very much.
All right, so first of all, thank you, Steve, for that excellent summary of the conversation. I think it was really meaningful to lay bare the disagreements in the room. I think that was incredibly helpful and honest about where we are. These are a lot of the movers and shakers in religious studies education, but we don't all agree on a lot of the terms of the conversation. I think as a summary, as a way to wrap up, I want to return to the DNA of the founder of our center, of Charles Haynes, and one of the books that came out in 2007, Finding Common Ground. And I think common ground and compromise are often conflated in our conversation. That compromise, to me, involves two people who disagree, who negotiate their beliefs or bend on some of their beliefs or give up their positions in order to meet in some middle area or in a third area. And I think for me, finding common ground is more about standing firm in where you are and trying to find in the circles of your Venn diagrams where you intersect, not necessarily having to compromise. And so I think as we move forward, at least as a starting point, what I hope this summit has done is establish or name or identify areas of common ground. And I think that there are significant areas of common ground from which we can build. And so I'm really excited about that. And I also want to note that the disagreements can be very generative. I think I've mentioned this in many other spaces, but not in this space. The reason that I do the work that I do is because of Steve Prothero. In 2009, I was in college reading as a new religious studies student, thinking a lot about the study of religion, and my mentor, Janet Cooper Nelson, handed me Steve's book, Religious Literacy. And that was the beginning of my journey. It led to co-curricular courses on, we called it the Religious Literacy Project at Brown. And we used Steve's book as a sort of a textbook for a number of years, and it was out of the conversations with my fellow students that I came to realize that I didn't agree with everything that Steve was saying in that book, God forbid. But that disagreement and my interest in exploring what that disagreement might mean led me to the Religious Literacy Project. It led me to Diane Moore. I found that I didn't agree with Diane on everything that she was saying. And so my journey has been one of trying to understand how I can find common ground among various groups to better advocate for the study of religion in public schools. And so my dream, my goal, what I hope you have gotten out of this project, this summit, is that there are many, many, many different ways that we can work together authentically and be ourselves in working together and advance a common goal, which I do hope that we can name as religious literacy, even if we disagree on about the exact definition of that term, in order to my normative commitment is to make a better society, to really try to see religious studies education as a key component of civic education. So there's a lot more that we can say here, but it is time, and I do want to respect your time. I know many people are flying out tonight. Some people are flying out tomorrow. I want to thank you so much for being here, giving us an entire day. I know is a big ask for many of you. Many of you have flown out from far away to be here. Thank you so much. If you are interested in a photo, we can take a photo outside. But please feel free to be in contact with me, unless this is going to be an opt-out. So you have to opt out. Otherwise, I will share your contact information with everyone here so that you all can speak with one another. I'll be working with Kate and with David to come up with a white paper that names a lot of the key components of the conversation. I don't know that we'll do it necessarily better than Steve just did it, but try to name the disagreements and also the agreements, action items that we can take moving forward. And so we'll share that with you, and we invite your feedback on that white paper as well. And if you have any ideas about how we can move forward, please send those along to me. But for now, I want to say thank you to all of you. Thanks again to the RFC team, to Templeton Religion Trust, and the Foundation for Religious Literacy for supporting this, to our co-conveners, American Academy of Religion, National Council for the Social Studies, Boston College's Lynch School of Education, to the Newseum team, FFI, AV, PUC, for taking so much good care of us today, and to all of you, again, just for coming. The last housekeeping item is just about your reimbursements, which might be top of mind for some people. So I did send you the forms for reimbursement for your travel. Please send those to me and CC Robin Geis. Robin was, her contact information was in the digital program that I sent. If you send them to both of us, we will process your reimbursement as soon as possible. So thank you to all of you, and It's been such a pleasure. I hope you have a great weekend and have a safe journey home.